And this has been a long time coming. It's something we've been working on for quite a while. Okay, get back there. There we go. So just as an overview for anyone who's not as familiar with coastal A zones and where they fall on the map, typically you have V zones and then the A zone. The A zone is now divided into the coastal A zone and the rest of the A zone. They do have terms for each of these. In addition to coastal A zone, it's also called the moderate wave action area. And this is the minimal wave action area. Those are divided by the limit of moderate wave action on the FEMA flood maps. And the difference is the velocity zone has wave heights of 3 feet or greater, and the moderate wave action area has wave heights between 1.5 and 3 feet. And what they found is that can still cause damage, structural damage. And so that's why it's important to designate separately. And the minimal wave action area has less than 1.5 foot breaking waves. So if we look at how that looks on a flood map, oops, that's not next. Sorry, that will be next. Give you some more background on the reason for coastal A zones. The Building Sciences Division of FEMA does a lot of post-disaster assessments, and they have also done laboratory tests to confirm that waves greater than 1.5 feet cause significant damage to structures built to A zone standards. And that could be slab on grade, solid foundation, anything that would be considered okay for an A zone in the past if it's subject to that level of wave energy, can cause damage. And so they incorporated this concept into the 2000 edition of the Coastal Construction Manual, talked about coastal A zones, and recommended that buildings in these zones be built to V zone standards. So the FEMA Coastal Construction Manual talks about the types of hazards in V zones, such as wave effects, velocity flows, erosion, scour, high winds, and has found that those same effects occur in coastal A zones, and that's why they should be built to V zone standards. So the FEMA Mitigation Assessment Team reports have documented structural damage in coastal A zone conditions in Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Fran, Ivan, Ike, Sandy, Irma, and I haven't updated this with the latest mitigation assessment team reports, but there you get the point. There's been a lot of documentation of the damages they're seeing to things built to traditional A zone standards. So the 2006 and subsequent editions of the International Building Code require conformance with ASCE 24, flood resistant design and construction. And that includes building structures in coastal A zones to V zone standards. So in Massachusetts, the history, and one quick damage example, since we don't want lots of words on slides, so we got to have pictures here. This is an example from Hurricane Ivan Mitigation Assessment Team report, where a house that was built slab on grade got island wave action on the back side of the barrier beach. And that wave action was enough to cause structural damage to this building. So the history of coastal A zones in Massachusetts and why we haven't had them in our code sooner is that FEMA began delineating the limit of moderate wave action on the farms in flood studies initiated after 2009. As of 2016, not all the firms had LMWAs, and there were some that weren't consistent with FEMA mapping guidance that had been issued after they were mapped. So to develop a consistent, accurate, accessible coastal A zone data set for the coast, CZM and DCR worked together to hire a consultant to update all the LMWAs on the FEMA maps and make them consistent with the FEMA guidance. So that didn't involve any new flood mapping. It's just using the applicable mapping guidance to delineate those zones based on the mapping that was already conducted. So basically delineate that area where you have the 1.5 to 3 foot breaking wave on each transect, and then do the interpolation in between the transects. So the updated data was submitted to FEMA for review and incorporated into the firms. That took longer than it took me to say that. It was a couple of years of process, but we did get that updated in 2017. And then we felt more comfortable with moving forward with trying to get the coastal A zone standards in the building code. So when you look at the FEMA flood maps, the map service center is what I recommend for a place to find those. And if you type in an address, you will be able to see the limit of moderate wave action. And so this line that has the triangles on it is your limit of moderate wave action. So in this example, you have a velocity zone out here. Coming in to the white line is the boundary between the V and the A zone. And the area landward of that white line that is still before the line with the triangles is your coastal A zone or moderate wave action area. And then what is landward of or up gradient of that black line with the triangles is the minimal wave of action area, or the A zone, where you don't have the breaking wave action. So that is how you would tell the difference between the V and coastal A in this situation. But if we look over here, the topography is a little bit different, and you go straight from a V zone to an X zone. And so you don't actually have a coastal A polygon in this location. In reality, we know that there is a gradual change, but if those zones are thinner than 80 feet, they don't map those on the firms. So there are going to be situations where you don't have the coastal A. And if you're trying to figure out, is that in fact the case? Is that white line in the same place as that? You can go in and turn off those lines in the National Flood Hazard Layer viewer. So if you go into that NFHL viewer, you check the drop-down box for the layers, and then click on the drop-down for the NFHL, scroll down to limit of moderate wave action, turn that off. So I unchecked the box there, and now you can see the white line that is in fact the boundary between the V and the X zone. So that's one way. If you've got things that are in the way on the map and you're trying to see, you can turn things off in that layer if you're not familiar with that already. So that's the quick introduction to the background on coastal A zones, and some of the basis why it's important to get them into our codes. Now that we have those updated for firms with the LMWAs, we moved forward working with the building Board of Building Regulations and Standards to put the coastal A zones standards in the 10th edition, and that is what we'll see when the draft 10th edition comes out. Now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to talk more about the actual standards.
Thank you, Rebecca. I am just going to see if I can share my screen. Can anybody see my screen, or is that just me seeing it?
Yes, it looks good, Eric.
Excellent. That's always the hardest part. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the proposed changes to the building code in the 10th edition. I'll be talking about the changes that are significant. There are a few other odds and ends here and there that I won't be covering, so I'll just be talking about what I consider to be the big things, again, proposed, not yet approved. Like Rebecca said, we've been part of a working group, and the big change would be the coastal A zones, inclusion of coastal A zone standards. the 10th edition will be based on the 2021 iCode series, as you can see on this page. And like I said, big changes, inclusion of coastal A-zone standards, and the other big change, increased freeboard. Again, proposed changes not yet approved. I'm probably going to say that a few times just in case somebody tunes in late and thinks we're talking about changes that have happened. They haven't happened yet, but as of right now, they are what is proposed. Like Rebecca said, coastal A-zone standards have been in the iCodes and in ASCE 2414 for some time. We've removed those standards by amendment in previous editions of the code, but this time around, at least to some extent, those standards will be included. So I'm just going to go over a couple of details. I'm going to start with, this is the 9th edition residential code. This is how we add freeboard in the residential code in the 9th edition, and we're going to do it the same way in the 10th edition as proposed. In the residential code only, we add freeboard by defining the design flood elevation as being the base flood elevation plus the required freeboard. So as you can see here, I won't read the whole slide for you, but for A zones in the 9th edition residential code, design flood elevation is the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. So when you're reading the standards and it says that in an A zone, your lowest floor has to be at or above design flood elevation, well, that's defined as base flood elevation plus 1 foot. Most common question I get is somebody reads the code and says, I thought we required freeboard in an A zone or a V. Well, we do. You just have to know where it is. So in V zones in the 9th edition, design flood elevation defined as base flood plus 2 feet. Now in the base code 9th edition, in the amendments, we have a table of amended freeboards. So the freeboard requirements are essentially the same, 1 foot in A zone, 2 foot in V zones. And you see all these different requirements here because it's a minimum elevation for lowest floor, minimum elevation for flood resistant materials, minimum elevation for mechanical and electrical equipment, and so forth. But again, it would be 1 foot in A zones, 2 foot in V zones, with the exception of flood design class 4, which is typically critical facilities. And across the board in the 9th edition, that was base flood plus 2 feet or 500-year flood elevation. So that's the freeboard that we're using right now in the 9th edition. So let me just start talking about what we're proposing for the 10th edition for both freeboard and for coastal A zone requirements. As I said, here we are in A zones. In A zones, we have your 1 foot required freeboard. So that's what exists in the 9th edition. What is proposed in the 10th edition is 2 feet. So for an A zone construction, that would apply to new construct. This is regular A zone, not coastal A zone. New construction, substantial improvement is required to be elevated to base flood elevation plus 2 feet. Okay. So now V zones and coastal A zones. Remember, we didn't have the coastal A zone standards before, but for what is being proposed for the standard's going to be a little bit different in the residential code and in the base code. So I separated them out here. So in A zone, in V zones, I'm sorry, in the 9th edition, we required plus 2 feet, as I said before. The draft 10th edition, as it is proposed, includes coastal A zones in that same section for requirements for V zones. So the residential code section R322.3 will apply to V zones and coastal A zones. And the proposal in the residential code is that it would apply to new and substantially improved structures in V zones or coastal A zones, and the freeboard requirement is 3 feet. So in a V zone, the elevation requirement is that the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member is at the required elevation. So in a coastal A zone now, coastal structures in coastal A zones will have to meet that same standard open pile foundation. Bottom of the lowest structural horizontal member is 3 feet above base flood elevation. Okay. So the base code is going to be a little bit different. Again, in the base code, the 10th edition would require new buildings in the V zone and substantially improved buildings in the V zone to have a freeboard requirement of 3 feet. In the base code, the coastal A zone standards would apply to new construction, but they would not apply to substantial improvement of existing buildings, okay? The freeboard requirement for the coastal A zone buildings will still be 3 feet, but the existing buildings will be able to meet will be able to meet A zone standards instead of the same standards as V zones. That's a little confusing even to me, but it's right the way I wrote it down here on the slide. Okay, there is an exception, and it applies to coastal A zone structures in both the residential code and the base code. The language I used here is from the residential code, but the exception is the same. So V zone structures in V zones, new or substantially improved, have the requirement, again, the open pile foundation, but in a coastal A zone, the new construction in the coastal A zone would be allowed to be built on a solid wall foundation that is solidly backfilled with soil or gravel to the underside of the floor system. So that is the exception, and it applies to new construction in coastal A zones, not in V zones, however. Okay. Now, this is just a look at what that code section would look like from the residential code. Like I said before, we are again in the residential code defining the design flood elevation as base flood elevation plus required freeboard. So for A zones, again, that's going to be plus 2 feet. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That's going to be plus 2 feet instead of plus 1. For V zones and coastal A zones, it's plus 3 feet instead of what was 2 feet for the V zones. And this table in the base code, in the amendments for the base code, is essentially the same table as is in the amendments to the 9th edition base code. And you'll notice, again, flood design class 1, 2, and 3, they're identical all the way down. It's plus 2 feet for all the A zone requirements, plus 3 feet for all the V zone requirements. And for flood design class 4, it's where it's permitted, it's base flood elevation plus 3 feet. My last 2 slides are informational slides about basis for freeboard and some specific recommendations. So for informational purpose, I'll leave that stuff there and people can read that at their leisure. And I am done.
So I think, what some of what we're trying to make sure you're aware of is the basis for these improvements to the code. There is a lot of damage information behind why these were put into the code. For coastal A zones, they were getting damage when they were building to traditional A zone standards. For freeboard, the basis has to do with some of the uncertainty associated with predicting the extent of flooding, the fact that 30% of the claims are outside the map flood zone and beyond that, and taking into account some of the potential effects of sea level rise and erosion, which are ongoing since the maps were created. So we think there's a lot of support, scientific support for these improvements in the code, and we're happy to take questions, but we would certainly appreciate your support when the code comes out for public comment.
I'm reading from the questions that have been typed in, and there's a few. I see Joy has asked, can you explain about the substantial improvement exception again? Okay, so the coastal A zone requirement is that, generally speaking, buildings in coastal A zones will be treated like buildings in V zones. For residential structures, all new construction and all substantial improvements are required to meet coastal A zone standards, okay? Under the base code, so for buildings that are regulated under the base code, the coastal A zone standards apply only to new construction. Existing buildings are allowed to meet regular A zone standards. Okay, that's one. I think that was the only thing that was from my presentation. Rebecca?
Yeah, so there was a question about the distance that FEMA doesn't map. It's any zone when they're transitioning zones. If the zones are too narrow, then they don't consider that that they can map it. So technically, in that example I showed, you wouldn't go straight from a velocity zone condition to an X zone condition. Obviously, there is a transition there, but the A zone is too narrow to map, so they don't map it. You'll also see places where you go from V to minimal wave action area, and you'll not see any coastal A zone. That's because it's too narrow to map. That comes up quite a bit on the FEMA flood maps. Yes, so there's a question about whether there's a specific direction that the triangles point. They are pointing to the higher hazard side of the line. So in the example I showed, it wasn't always clear which way was seaward and which way was landward. And obviously flood zones are going to depend on topography. So it's not always clear, but the triangle does point towards the higher hazard side, which is the coastal A zone side of the line, or the B zone side of the line. Great question, Ben. The only question we can't answer is when these new regs will actually be out for public comment. The Board of Building Regulations and Standards and the Division of Public Licensure are in the process of going through that internal state approval, final stages of the approval process to get them out as soon as they can, and it'll be posted on their website. There will be a formal public comment period. And certainly, those of you who are familiar with flood damages and have seen the need for this, would be really helpful to see those comments and support them. Any other questions? Is everybody eating?
Rebecca, it looks like a couple more questions are coming in, but I'll just also note that I did change the settings so people can unmute themselves and show their video if you want to just ask your question out loud in the meantime. But Rebecca, there's a few more.
So in situations where the coastal A zone isn't mapped, it's too narrow. How should a surveyor handle that? So right now we do have some guidance we've provided about mapping that line, which basically is what is mapped on the FEMA A zone. I mean, the FEMA flood map line. So if it's going from V to A, you're going to use that line as mapped. There is guidance available that DCR and CZM put together on how to map those lines and figure out. But you would just be using the V zone versus the minimal wave action area, or the V zone versus the X zone. So we don't have more detailed information available for those. So in terms of the question about how this compares to what other states are doing, other states are moving forward with adopting the coastal A zone standards. Rhode Island actually adopted it before they had all of the LMWAs squared away on their maps, and it was a lot more confusing. They had a lot of challenges with trying to implement that. So that's part of the reason that we held off and have waited as long as we have. Noah, I'm not sure if we can make the slides available or how massFM has that set up to handle.
Rebecca and Eric, if you email me the slides, we can put them up probably on our website in the events page, and then this is recorded and will be available on our will be available online. We are still working through the details of how to make all that happen. But if you keep emailing us about it, it's more likely to get resolved sooner.
Any other questions other than the coastal A zone terminology being confusing? We didn't create it. We're not responsible for that part.
That's funny because that actually was one of my questions, was how do you differentiate between a coastal A zone and an A zone that is along the coast versus like riverine?
It's kind of unfortunate terminology that we've been trying to work with. So for DEP is working on land subject to coastal storm flowage regs, and they're not going to use the coastal A zone terminology. They're going to refer to them as moderate wave action area and minimal wave action area. It's a little less awkward than saying the coastal A zone and the rest of the A zone. But, you know, trying to explain to the Board of Building Regulations and Standards that no, this is not all A zones along the entire coast. This is just a very small subset. No freaking out, which did occur anyway.
Yeah.
But we did narrow it down and did some initial assessment of, you know, how many acres or how much area is that. So it actually turned out to be a much smaller area than people were originally thinking when we did the mapping. So I think the total area for the whole coast was 9 square miles. But once we looked at what was already wetlands that you wouldn't be developing anyway, what's already coastal dunes, where pilings are required and V-zone construction's required anyway, it actually came down to a relatively small amount of new area that would be required to comply with V-zone standard. So it's not as much area as people are originally thinking. So the next question is, can I remind you what a zone AO is? So AO zones are overwash areas, and those are typically where you have flow going over a landform, over a seawall. We don't see as many of the AO zones on the newer maps. Those seem to have been disappearing. But so an AO zone is more of an overwash zone, and that usually has a depth associated with it. So there is, particularly along the coast, moving water associated with that, but not waves, at least as mapped or as defined. But we do have coastal A zones in a lot of areas. Exactly. The AO zones have a depth. So we thought we'd have a little bit more to present to you with the draft code out, but those are the big changes that we anticipate particularly for flood zones in the 10th edition code.
Well, I can say thank you to Rebecca and Eric. And if people have more questions and more questions come in, feel free to answer them. One question did come in to me about continuing education credits for this. We, massFM, are working to make CFM credits available for these. But if you can send the massFM Gmail account an email if you are a CFM and would like credits, that will help us to make that happen. So no guarantees on this specific event today, but we will try, and that's something that generally we're trying to do, is to make sure that we can get CFM credits for the webinars, or the lunch and learns is what I mean.
So there's another question about the timing on the 10th edition. Unfortunately, that's not something that we know at this point. We know that they have approved the code at the BBRS level. It has gone through the State Building Code Coordinating Council. It needs to go to their commissioner and then the governor's office before it gets published by the Secretary of State. But there will be a formal comment period published. Yeah, it's really hard to know the timing right now. It is a new administration, and those some of those approval processes or some of what gets worked out takes a little bit of time to get those sorted out in the beginning. You want to be able to contact us? Geez, you want everything. Thanks, Troy. All right. Eric, you can type your email in the chat and I'll type mine in. So you can certainly email us with questions. We're happy to help. As Joy said, Eric is definitely more of the building code whiz than I am. But we both have different expertise that we bring to the group that's working on the code. And we provide technical assistance and answer questions on the various codes all the time.
Thanks again, Rebecca and Eric. I'm gonna stop recording.